Is Bradwell nuclear power station. It started working in July 1962 and was one of the first two nuclear stations to be operated in England by the Central Electricity Generating Board. Ever since it opened, it has played an important part helping to supply power to our power-hungry nation. Bradwell and the other nuclear stations differ from the ordinary conventional generating station only in one particular, their source of energy. Most power stations burn coal to produce heat, to make steam, to drive turbines, to turn generators, which produce the electrical power on which industry and home depends. Some stations burn oil, which in turn heats the steam to drive the turbine and so on. But at Bradwell, the heat is provided by nuclear energy, the controlled release of which, in various forms, is perhaps the outstanding event of the mid-20th century. Now, before we go round this station, let's first of all try and understand exactly what we mean by nuclear or atomic energy, as it's sometimes called. What exactly is it? For centuries, the atom was regarded as the smallest particle into which matter could be subdivided. The atomic weights of every known element were classified and tabulated. Each atom was thought to be a minute, solid, indestructible sphere. But now, in the 20th century, we think of the atom as a miniature solar system, with tiny planetary electrons revolving round a central sun, the nucleus. Even the nucleus is made up of smaller particles, positively charged protons, and neutrons, which have no electrical charge. These particles only occupy a minute part of the volume swept out by the electrons. The basic particles of the atom are therefore negatively charged electrons, positive protons, and neutrons. They can all exist independently in the atom and be used as missiles to break more particles off other atoms. The most effective missiles are the neutrons, but there is so much space inside an atom that the neutron may miss the nucleus altogether. With some types of atom, they just bounce off the nucleus and do no damage. Other elements, such as boron or cadmium, absorb harmlessly into their nuclei, but one element is unique in nature: uranium. This has a rare isotope, or chemical twin, with 3 less neutrons in its nucleus than uranium-238, the common variety, hence its name uranium-235. Even when all movement is stopped, it is still impossible to show in a diagram any difference between the two, but the 235 isotope has this property. A bombarding neutron can cause its nucleus to break up violently, releasing atomic energy largely in the form of heat. The heat produced during nuclear fission can now be used to generate power, but to get continuous output of power, the process of nuclear fission must obviously be sustained. Let us examine nuclear fission again, this time in more detail. The bombarding neutron strikes the nucleus, which begins to split into two. Radiation is emitted. All the particles now redistribute themselves and form 2 new, smaller atoms. These fly apart, and the energy which bound the original nucleus together is released. 2 or 3 neutrons also escape, and these are all capable of producing more fissions in other fissile atoms, thereby starting a chain reaction. At a certain concentration, each fission causes only 1 new one. This is the moment of criticality, and heat is produced, depicted here as a blue glow. In order to illustrate how this heat is produced in practice, let's look at a model of a reactor core. It is a cylinder of graphite which may be 30 feet high and 40 feet in diameter, penetrated by a large number of holes into which the fuel is loaded. Graphite is used for the construction of the core because it has the property of slowing down neutrons by collision with its own atoms to a speed at which they are most effective. In preparing the reactor to go to power, fuel is loaded into the holes, starting at the center of the core and working outwards. When fuel has been loaded to a limited radius, there is enough present to ensure that neutrons escaping naturally from one fuel element collide with fuel elements in neighboring holes, producing heat and more neutrons continuously. The reactor is said to be critical. This action can be stopped immediately by lowering boron steel in the form of rods into the core. This material absorbs all the neutrons. All the remaining holes in the reactor core are filled with fuel. And when the boron steel control rods are withdrawn, the reactor becomes critical and heat is produced. The heat is taken away to be used in the boilers by carbon dioxide gas, which is pumped through the fuel holes. The reactor heat output is thus controlled by two things: the amount of carbon dioxide gas pumped through the core and the position of the neutron-absorbing control rods within the core. The reactor is entirely safe because it can be stopped immediately if required by dropping the control rods under the force of gravity fully into the reactor core. The reactor core, then, is the center of things, the heat source. Its heat output is controlled by the amount of gas circulation and by the position of the control rods. The heat is used to produce steam in the boilers, which drives the steam engines or turbines, which in turn drive electricity generators. Now, before we go round the power station, let's take a look at one or two of the things which it won't be practical for you to see. Remember, there's nothing dangerous, nothing secret about a nuclear power station. There's nowhere in the working areas that you can't go, and by prior arrangement, a visitor with a specialized interest can see anything. But in practice, there are naturally places that would be uncomfortable or inconvenient for a large party. So here are some shots from behind the scenes. This is the fuel store, where the uranium is kept before it is loaded into the reactor. Each rod is about 36 inches long and rather less than a penny in width. Its value? Each bar is worth up to 250 pounds, and there are some that weighs about 30 pounds. There is nothing mysterious about them at this stage. The elements arrive by normal transport and are moved into the fuel stores. At this stage, they are very slightly radioactive, no more than the dial of a luminous watch. It's not until they are massed together in a designed formation that they become what scientists call critical and start their chain reaction. Now, let's have a look at one of the things you will see and which most people regard as the highlight of their visit. This is the charge floor, which is directly over the top of the reactor, separated from it by many feet of protective concrete. Now, this floor is perfectly safe, like everything else at a nuclear station. Unless there's actually work being done on it, you can walk on it, and possibly you will. The reactor below it isn't a sort of wild, molten sun in miniature, giving off thousands of degrees of heat, as some of us have imagined. Very far from it. Everything is controlled. The fuel elements are only allowed to heat up sufficiently for the water system to produce steam at the ordinary sort of temperature for an industrial process, very considerably below the heat of a steel furnace. The charge floor, of course, is the only entrance to the reactor from the outside world. It is from here that new uranium rods are added to the fuel in the reactor, and from here the first stages in the removal of spent fuel elements are organized. The fueling machine can alone connect with and feed the reactor. Behind it is a control room, from whence these vital operations are decided and made. A single uranium element has a life of years in the reactor. By then, it is spent fuel and it needs to be taken out. So, the fueling machine moves over the charge floor, probes and draws off the spent fuel, which it deposits into a deep water storage pond. Now we go to an area that you won't see on your tour, Again, not because there is any risk about it, but because this is a handling area and you would have to wear waterproof boots and overalls. These are, in fact, the cooling ponds, into which the spent elements are placed after they have been withdrawn from the reactor by the fueling machine. At this stage, very obviously, they are handled by remote control, for they are still radioactive. On the bed of the pond is the de-splittering machine. This rather complex mechanism cuts through the splitter braces and allows the splitters to be removed, providing for easier and more economic storage and transport of the elements. After maneuvering into steel skips, the spent fuel elements remain on the bed of the ponds for about 100 days, slowly losing quite a lot of their radioactivity. The water has been treated with caustic soda to prevent the elements from corroding. Finally, the elements, which can still only be handled by remote control, are loaded into a heavy steel flask. This is slowly raised from the bed of the ponds, and after a prolonged shower to remove the contaminated water, the flask is loaded onto a vehicle for transportation to the Atomic Energy Authority. Here, various processes can be applied to the spent fuel to extract useful material for application in many other branches of industry. Another place you won't see on your visit, for there is always a lot going on there and the area is rather small for visitors, is the Health Physics Laboratory. Here, the health physicists carry out routine checks on all aspects associated with health in the running of the station. In addition, the department runs an elaborate field investigation conducted from another laboratory just outside the station boundary, where it checks the area for miles around the power station to make absolutely sure that the natural radioactivity of the surrounding countryside is not added to in any way by the operation of the station. Samples such as grass, root crops, shellfish, seaweed, etc., are collected and brought into the laboratory, where they are first reduced to an ash, after which a count is made. These results show that there is no more radioactivity in the district than there is anywhere else. You see, nothing is left to chance. That's why working at a nuclear power station is a lot safer than crossing Piccadilly. So there we are. A glimpse backstage at the things it won't be practical to show you, and a rather hurried look at the principles of a nuclear reactor and the world of nuclear physics behind it.